AI for cause of death prediction. My name's Abraham Flaxman, or AB for short. Um, and to begin, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. This research was conducted on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. I'll also share this disclosure about funding support. And what I hope to tell you in just 20 minutes is about generative AI for cause of death prediction from verbal autopsy interviews. But to get there, I want to frame this in terms of sustainable development goals, and especially some of the health ones that I think we're all very interested in, and how cause of death prediction can be useful in pursuing these goals, and how verbal autopsy interviews are one of the most important ways of filling gaps in our knowledge about cause of death predictions. And then I'll get to the generative AI for cause of death prediction from verbal autopsy interviews. Now, I'm sure many of us are familiar with Sustainable Development Goals, and my colleagues at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation have just released updated projections in the part of the Goalkeepers report about some of these health-related Sustainable Development Goals. Maternal mortality, under 5 mortality, neonatal mortality, all of these targets have a bit of a way to go to make it to where we want to be in 2030. And if you look at where we are now, progress has sort of stalled out during the COVID period. And my colleagues have worked hard to project where things might go. In this middle line in blue, you can see that for under 5 mortality and neonatal mortality, we're not quite on track. We're close to our goal, but have a way to go. For maternal mortality, we're actually kind of a bit off. And even in their sort of optimistic scenario shown in green, we still have a ways to bend that curve to make it to our target of 70 per 100,000 births by 2030. Now, those sort of top level estimates for global burden mask substantial variation at the regional and local level. And my colleagues who have made those estimates from the previous slide have also broken things down by location, showing, for example, that in the Philippines, it seems likely that they have already reached their Sustainable Development Goal on child mortality in 2019. And projecting forward, we might expect their progress to continue, making it seem very certain to have attained their goal in 2030. On the other hand, there are many countries that are far off from making their goal in 2030 if progress continues as it has been in the past. That is why I think it is very important not just to think about where we are and where we might go if things continue, but how we might be able to bend these curves. The estimates that my colleagues have been making in the Goalkeepers report for Sustainable Development Goals, therefore, are very important for knowing where we are. But when it comes to bending those curves, it's important to go deeper and to understand what are the main causes of death preventing us from reaching these goals and reducing deaths. The Global Burden of Disease Study has dedicated a lot of effort to breaking down deaths by cause. This is a beautiful three-dimensional rendering of what things looked like globally at a point years ago. And it's a visual form called a tree map that is, in a sense, a glorified pie chart. And the 3D-ness of it makes it look cool, but is not important to understanding it. If you go online to vishub.healthdata.org, there's an updated and interactive version of it that's not as flashy looking, but is still very useful. It shows, for example, how important neonatal deaths are to child deaths, as well as how big players outside of the neonatal period are LRI, congenital deaths, malaria, diarrheal diseases, etc. And just like looking at those targets at the global level, looking at this decomposition at the global level masks substantial heterogeneity. Now, if we had more time, I would demo how you can drill down in different directions using these tools, because as Bill Gates once said, it takes a while to get good at finding your way around these tools, but once you do, they are amazingly informative. Since time is limited, I will just direct you to specific locations. For example, instead of looking globally, here is the composition of child deaths from South Sudan. And what you can see here is a big block of malaria deaths and a big block of diarrheal disease deaths, and also PEM, meaning protein energy malnutrition deaths. And if you were trying to bend the curve to reach goals in South Sudan, you might employ different strategies than if you were trying to bend that same curve in Fiji to reach that same goal, because their diarrheal disease is still a problem, but malaria, we believe, is not so much of a problem. And those lower respiratory infections are a big problem, but look also at how much bigger congenital diseases are, and STIs, really meaning the vertical transmission of syphilis, something that is definitely approachable from a public health perspective, if you know it's an important part of bending that curve. The data savvy viewers of this talk might have been wondering, what is the evidence base for that picture that I was showing you on the previous 3 slides? And the answer is the best data for understanding the causes of death comes from vital registration systems. MakeDeathsCount is working hard to shore up vital registration systems around the world, but at present, there are many places where it is most important to figure out where to bend the curve, where there are no years of vital registration data available, when my colleagues have sort of scoured what's out there, looking for all the data they can to fill in those tree maps. And that brings us to the verbal autopsy interview, because one of the best ways to fill the gaps when you don't have death certificates coming from a vital registration system is the verbal autopsy. And I imagine that there are some people in this audience who are very familiar with verbal autopsy, but I imagine there may be others viewing this who are not. It is a method to assess the cause of death, and it's based on an interview with a relative or person familiar with the events that led to the death. That's the verbal part. And it contains both closed, structured questions and open, sort of open-ended, just tell us in your own words questions. And it has been around for about 50 years. The Million Deaths Study in India is one major application to understand what's happening in population health. And another important milestone in the history of verbal autopsy is the Population Health Metrics Research Consortium study, which I will be referring back to when we start talking about AI. That has been very important in evaluating the quality of verbal autopsy interviews, because it collected data which in the machine learning parlance we might call labeled data, data where we've conducted a verbal autopsy so we know what the interview responses might look like. But separately from that exercise, we've looked at clinical diagnostic criteria to understand from a different perspective very surely what the underlying cause of death was. And it's from that that we can do validation of methods from going from verbal autopsy interviews to underlying causes of death. If you have something in mind for the kinds of questions that you might hear in a verbal autopsy interview, you can check if it matches the kinds of things on this screenshot I've taken. There are questions like, did the deceased have a fever during her last illness? And for how many days or months before her death did the fever start and end? Those are the ones that I'm calling structured questions. It also has unstructured questions, sometimes called the verbatim section, which is simply the question, we would like to hear details about everything that happened during the last illness, starting from the beginning, and also what happened during the final hours of the death. And for those of you who have a perhaps clinical mindset or background, here's an example of a verbal autopsy interview where I know the cause underlying this death from that Population Health Metrics Research Consortium study I mentioned. So you can sort of test against your own clinical knowledge the challenge of this kind of work. What would you say the underlying cause was if you heard that the deceased was a 53-year-old male with asthma, heart disease, hypertension, and signs and symptoms including ankle swelling, puffiness, coughing, difficulty breathing, and a protruding belly? And in that verbatim section, free text that included keywords asthma, breath, heart, lung, swell, and water. Now, a lot of doctors who I have given this talk to have looked at this and said, you know, that sounds like heart failure. And that's right, but the Global Burden of Disease study considers heart failure an intermediate cause of death and posits that there's always some underlying cause of the heart failure. that gives you some idea of how challenging this prediction task is, because according to the PHMRC study, the correct answer in this case is that the underlying cause was COPD. And I get really excited about gathering this data and analyzing this data, and it is important to reflect that especially when we're looking at these SDG targets, each one of these interviews represents an absolute human tragedy. The kinds of data that are in this PHMRC validation database include some of the stories of the worst days in people's lives. And so, for example, interview with a parent who explained that our baby girl was born in a hospital, and after 2 months, she started to have coughing problems and a fever. We took her to the hospital. Doctor tested and said her condition was serious, referred to another hospital. She was given oxygen and glucose. The doctors informed us they could not be certain if she would survive. She had fits, she lost consciousness, and she died. And so my hope really from this work is that by using AI methods to improve cause of death predictions from taking these verbal autopsy interviews, we'll be able to make better strategies to achieve sustainable development goals to prevent these unnecessary deaths. And I am now ready to tell you about how we can use generative AI for cause of death prediction from verbal autopsy interviews. Because you've probably at this point heard jargon about generative AI. And what I mean when I say that is something specific. I'm referring to the use of artificial intelligence to create or generate new content, images, videos, text, anything that we're generating. Some examples are ChatGPT, Claude, Google's Gemini, Stable Diffusion, Sora. But in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focused on text generating AIs because I'm thinking about the verbal autopsy interview results after they have been transcribed, and there's structured information and text data available for analysis. And chatbots, if you have played with them, seem like magic. It is amazing what an AI can tell you in response to your text at this time in history. But lifting the curtain a little bit, generative AI chatbots are not magic. They're statistical language models, and that means they're a computational representation of a probability distribution over words. They predict the probability of every word or token that they have seen in their entire training corpus based on the previous tokens. What's the probability that WN is the next word if the previous words have been W1, W2, ... And with this in mind, you can start to understand how language models respond to prompts and how that can therefore potentially be used to predict the cause of death. This is sometimes called prompt engineering. It is a process of coming up with the text to feed into the AI so that when it generates additional text to come out, that can give us something that we want to know. In this case, like the underlying cause of death of a maternal death when we're trying to figure out what was the specific subcause leading to that death. There's a practice called prompt engineering, but I really don't consider it engineering. At this point, I think of it as an art of trial and error. One of the things that is a recommended part of that is telling the AI the role you want it to play. I've bolded here where I say, today, I would like you to act as an automated verbal autopsy algorithm. And then I give it a little description of what I mean by that. And then I tell it, I'm going to give you an interview, and I'll tell you on the next slide what an interview transcript might look like. And then another practice that I've heard a lot about, and I decided it was really important to test objectively, is called chain of thought reasoning. It seems that it helps chatbots to say things that we want if we tell them to think it through. And so I began by giving it this prompt, including the interview from a verbal autopsy, and saying, based on evidence, what do you think happened? Use all the relevant evidence. Do your best to answer, even if you're uncertain. The kinds of interview transcript I put in is exactly the questions and answers from those screenshots I showed you in the previous section. It starts with, did the respondent give consent? This is a research study. The answer is yes in all of these. Includes information about the respondent, gets into those signs and symptoms and healthcare experience that I showed you on the previous slide, and concludes with that so-called verbatim section. Please tell me in your own words what happened. And in this case, about a maternal mortality, it's a description of what happened. The response from the AI, for those of you with a clinical perspective, you can read through here and see if you think it seems pretty reasonable. I am a doctor of math, not medicine. But based on my exposure to the way I've seen doctors of medicine think this through, it is pretty impressive the kinds of next words that this AI responds using this statistical language model to just blah, blah, blah next words from this prompt. In fact, it sort of makes me stay up at night pondering existential crises like, am I just next word prediction? What is intelligence besides next word prediction? Now, we're not quite done with this process. The chain of thought has to be synthesized. And so I follow that up with a second prompt saying, thank you very much. I like what you've done here. Now select from this list the underlying cause of death. And I want you to do your best to answer this, but if there's not enough information to identify the subcause, then just tell me you're not able to determine with this information. And I have a list of subcauses of maternal mortality that matches the list of labeled data we collected in the PHMRC study. And so in this case, the AI response is a single letter, C. And for those of you with a clinical perspective, you can decide if that seems reasonable to you or not based on this list. Based on the PHMRC study, I can tell you that this is a correct answer. The underlying cause of death was indeed sepsis. Now, what I'm going to tell you about in the remaining time is how well this works. And to tell you that it works pretty well, I first have to tell you what I mean by what is working pretty well. The quality metric that I'm most focused on for this kind of verbal autopsy prediction is called cause-specific mortality fraction accuracy. And it's what you might call a population level prediction metric. It looks at the difference between the true value on the left and the predicted value on the right for each of the predicted causes, and adds up the absolute differences between truth and prediction, and then scales it and shifts it so that a 1.0 means perfect prediction. The left and the right bars are exactly the same for every cause. And a 0.0 means the worst you can do, as wrong as is possible based on doing bad prediction. And when we evaluate this, it is absolutely essential when evaluating any kind of AI predictions to make sure we are evaluating out of sample. That means we must not allow any of the information we're using to train the data set to leak into the data we're using to test the data set. This is complicated in these open AI and Claude.ai chatbots because we don't know what they've trained their models on. Like I told you, the PHMRC data has collected labeled data about causes of death, and it has been published and released. However, the specific subcauses of maternal mortality were not released. In previous efforts, we felt we simply could not predict them well enough to include them in any of our previous work. And besides that important caveat that you now know, it is not possible that the data I'm testing with has somehow made it into the ChatGPT or Claude.ai predictions. There's another very important part to doing out of sample validations for CSMF accuracy, which is when we sample without replacement to split data into a training data set and a testing data set, as is often done in machine learning methods, it's very important that we make sure the training data set has a different distribution than the testing data set. If we simply look at the test data pool, it will by random chance have a very similar distribution to the training data set, and therefore prediction could be too easy at the population level until we include this sampling part to get a test data set. So without further ado, let me show you how well things worked. And because the PHMRC data has previously also been given to doctors to do physician-certified verbal autopsy, I can contextualize how well AI works compared to how well humans work on this task. The answer is AI beats human experts at both individual level and population level quality for predicting pregnancy-related causes of death. This top row is how well doctors did in the physician certification process from the verbal autopsy interviews. At the population level, they attained a CSM accuracy of 50. That's halfway from 0.0, the worst they could do, to 100% the best they could do. And you can see that the direct prompt without chain of thought improves slightly on that. The chain of thought prompting improves slightly on that. And the latest and greatest until last week was thought by many to be Claude.ai, which was indeed the best in terms of population level prediction, attaining a value of 63, 13 points higher than the human doctors were able to perform. Since I prepared this slide, ChatGPT has released a preview of their new model, which is thought to be a very exciting innovation in the space of these chain of thought models. And so I'm very excited to see how that improves on what we have here. And so in summary, to reach sustainable development goals, we're going to need to bend these curves. And cause of death prediction, I think, is a really important part of making strategies to bend these curves. Where we don't have good vital registration data to inform this cause of death prediction, verbal autopsy interviews are our best alternative for filling in the gaps. And generative AI is going to allow better cause of death prediction from verbal autopsy interviews than was ever previously possible. We'll leave it there. Thank you all very much.